At this point, I would like to introduce President of the Institute of World Politics, Dr. John Lenczowski, who has a distinguished career in foreign relations and national security. Dr. Lenczowski is a graduate of University of Carolina, Berkeley, and holds a master's and PhD degree from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Lenczowski served in his career as in the State Department in the Bureau of European Affairs and Special Advisor to the Undersecretary for Public Affairs. He was also serving as a Director of the European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council. Dr. Lenczowski has been associated with several academic and research institutions in Washington area, including Georgetown University, University of Maryland, the American Enterprise Institute, Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Council for Inter-American Securities, just to name a few. Dr. Lenczowski is also an author of many professional books and articles, and I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Lenczowski.
Thank you very much, Maria. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here with you this morning, and we at the Institute of World Politics are delighted to be part of this conference and commemoration. I'd like to welcome all of you and particularly acknowledge the participation of distinguished members of Congress, Frank Spula, the President of the Polish American Congress, various representatives of Polish American veterans groups, the families of the Katyn victims, the families of the Polish deportees to the Gulag, and the representatives of many other academic, civic, and cultural organizations. I'd like to present a few thoughts to you this morning about the circumstances of the 1940 Katyn Forest Massacre, the cover-up by both the Soviet and Western governments, and the meaning and implications of these events for both current and future international relations. Although I think the facts are well known to all of you, and there is a timeline in your packet, I thought I would just refresh your memories a little bit to review some of these facts because I think it's appropriate. Let's remember, Nazi Germany and the USSR jointly started World War II with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the near simultaneous invasion of Poland. Several hundred thousand Polish soldiers and officers were taken prisoner. The Nazis and the Soviets exchanged thousands of them amongst themselves. At least 125,000 soldiers and officers were imprisoned by the NKVD, the Polish secret, the Soviet secret police. And meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Polish civilians were arrested by the NKVD and deported to the Gulag archipelago. One principle governing who was arrested was whether the person had higher education, came from certain types of family backgrounds, and therefore had the capacity for leadership and the preservation of, in the preservation of Polish culture and the resistance to Sovietization. The idea of the arrest of so many of these civilians, as well as the massacre of the officers in Katyn, was to eliminate the leadership class of the country. Of the various prisoners, some 22,000 were military officers who had been assembled in camps near Smolensk, in Ukraine and in Belarus. At the order of Stalin and his NKVD chief, Lavrentiy Beria, these prisoners were all shot and dumped in mass graves. The officers included members of every national, ethnic, and religious group that could be found in the multinational, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious Polish Commonwealth, including Roman Catholics, Muslim Tartars, and even the chief rabbi of the Polish army. The Nazis discovered a principal massacre site in the Katyn forest in 1943 and accused Moscow of the crime. But Soviet propaganda stoutly denied it and proceeded to deny it all the way up until 1990, when it was admitted by Mikhail Gorbachev. The US government had received several first-hand reports indicating Soviet guilt, but covered up its findings for years, principally to avoid offending Moscow. The official US cover-up involved the destruction of a key eyewitness report by a top US military intelligence official, the suppression of other credible reports, the transfer of some of the people who had been doing that to Siberian-style jobs, and so on and so forth. A congressional investigation in 1951 and 1952 made recommendations that the USSR be tried at the International Court of Justice, but the congressional recommendations were ignored, and to this date, many of the US government's documents in this case have never been released. There's apparently never a good time to do so, because we can never offend Moscow, especially when we're trying to reset relations with it. While there were glimmers of hope that the Russians would cooperate with the Poles in releasing archival materials, the waters have been muddied by Russian claims of a Polish genocide against Soviet prisoners of war in the Polish-Soviet War of 1920, even though those prisoners were part of an invading army, and even though they died of communicable diseases and not of actual murder. Even in the last 3 years, multiple Kremlin-allied politicians and media outlets continue to deny Soviet guilt. The problem here is that a crime was committed that may not unreasonably be interpreted to be part of a genocide, and that there has been no accountability. Why only part of a genocide? Because the larger genocidal enterprise required the elimination of the rest of those hundreds of thousands who either perished or almost perished in the Gulag. It was only Hitler's betrayal of his Soviet allies that saved those prisoners who were still alive. The Katyn massacre itself had its ripple effects. It was also an intelligence operation, which involved collecting the names of the Polish officers' families, who could now be arrested and imprisoned themselves as part of the larger effort to destroy those who were capable of preserving Polish culture. One of the NKVD agents responsible for this intelligence operation and later the murders was none other than Vasily Zarubin, who later was transferred to the United States to lead the Soviet NKVD intelligence espionage operation to steal American atomic secrets. The Polish victims, of course, were only some of the victims of the communist monstrosity. Millions of others were slaughtered, starved, enslaved, and worked to death by an ideological system responsible for more deaths at the hands of communist governments than perished in all the wars of the bloodiest century in human history. The victims were Balts, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Moldavians, Georgians, Armenians, Azeris, Volga Germans, Crimean Tatars, the Russians themselves, not to mention all sorts of other national groups that had found themselves captives within the larger Russian and then Soviet empires. Katyn and the elimination of Polish culture was a special case, however, because Poland represented a tradition of liberty that never existed anywhere else in the Russian Empire or the Soviet Empire, except in those lands that were part of the extended Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I argue that the Polish tradition of liberty may very well have been closer to that of the United States than any other country in the world, including England, for a variety of very good reasons, which it's beyond the scope of this talk to go into them. But that tradition of liberty was seen by the Kremlin as a mortal threat, and it had to be eliminated. This was one reason why the Soviets had to attack Poland in 1920. This is one reason for this entire attempt to eliminate the leadership class and the Katyn massacre itself. This was a potential existential threat, an ideological threat to the existence of the Soviet enterprise, the communist enterprise, and it had to be dealt with as one of the highest priorities. What has been so painful is how those in the West who claimed custodianship of liberty saw fit to betray those who shared those values more intensely with them than any other country in the world. If Katyn had not been covered up and suppressed in the West, and we all understand why, the Western allies felt as though they really needed Russian cooperation in the war on both fronts. But one wonders about whether the Russians would have just put their hands down and let either the Japanese or the Germans proceed just because they might have been offended by the revelation of their crime. But if it hadn't been covered up, the Anglo-American alliance would have been more realistic about who their Soviet allies really were. And greater realism could have prevented the betrayal of Poland and the rest of East Central Europe at the Yalta Conference and ultimately in Potsdam. In other words, witness to the truth could have changed the course of history. It did when Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II bore witness to the truth in the face of all the pressures to censor themselves out of political correctness and deference to the so-called cause of peace. But it was that witness to the truth that helped bring down the Soviet Empire itself. Today, true reconciliation of the kind that exists between Germans and Poles will not truly happen between Poles and Russians until the truth is out and at least some justice is rendered. The dead cry out for justice, and it continues to be denied. The crimes of communism have never been punished. They have not even been anathematized. And so those, even today, who march to the beat of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao Zedong continue to enjoy a free pass as new generations forget and never learn the monstrous consequences of the ideologies that have produced unprecedented human suffering. I have a friend named David Satter, one of the most prominent journalists, was the Moscow correspondent for the London Financial Times. He's just been writing a book that's entitled something to the effect of, it was a long time ago, and it never really happened anyway. If we want peace, if we want to prevent the repetition of such crimes, truth must be spoken and justice must be rendered. Thank you for listening.